Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today we're so pleased to have Ambassador Dino Djalal, who is a former ambassador from Indonesia to the United States. Ambassador, welcome.
Thanks, Wenqi. Good to see you again.
Yeah, we used to collaborate when you were the ambassador to Washington, D.C., and you were an outstanding ambassador, very well known in the D.C. community. So that was over 10 years ago. And so since you left Washington, D.C., tell us what the Indonesian-U.S. kind of relationship has been like over the last 10 years.
Well, it's remained stable. But obviously it fluctuates. The President Obama obviously was very popular in Indonesia.
He was born, he grew up, spent some years.
Yes, and he spoke Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, and he liked Indonesian food. So when he went there, it was one of the most highlighted, high-profile international visits that we've ever had, right? So that was the Obama era. I would call it the golden era, because you had an Indonesian president who studied in the U.S., and then you had the American president who studied or lived in Indonesia.
That's like rare, really
very rare. I don't think it's ever going to happen again.
You never know.
Yes, So, and we signed a comprehensive partnership with the United States that remains until today. Under Trump, there was a little bit of a jolt for long reasons that probably too long to explain. But basically, President Trump wasn't popular with some segments of Indonesian society, and I think that explains why President Joko Widodo had not visited Washington, D.C. during the time that he was president and during the time that Trump was president. So there were some complications.
What was the segment that you mentioned that sort of
so let's get into it a little bit. President Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv. And this sparked like a million people protests in Indonesia, Muslims, in front of, and it became a political issue. So embracing President Trump for the president who was running for re-election was seen as a liability. So that's what happened.
Understandable.
So
what about Biden now?
Things have become normalized again, if you can use that word. And there is good communication between President Biden and President Jokowi. They have met several times, and Indonesia welcomes the Indo-Pacific Economic framework that was announced by the United States, by the Biden administration. Secretary Blinken has visited Indonesia, the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin also, and vice versa, and so on. And Indonesia still sees the United States as a very critical player in the Indo-Pacific region. A lot of our policies are outlined, and we certainly want more trade and more investment from United States because our trade figures relative to China is quite minimal. Indonesia-U.S. trade is about
China is your largest
at about $100 billion, $100 billion, but the U.S. is about $30 billion.
Do you think through the Indo-Pacific economic framework, Indonesia will actually have some access to the U.S. market?
Well, we hope so. We hope so. The key now is in implementation. It's a good platform, and they have a lot of good policy initiatives. But the question is really in the implementation and execution.
In the details.
And the question from Indonesia is about sustainability, because there's going to be midterm elections and there's going to be the next presidential election 2024. So we really hope that at least the elements, the push, the drive of U.S. engagement in the region, not just strategically but economically, will be sustained and enhanced, because there are some places where the trade remains stagnant, right? It just goes around that area without doubling up, for example. So we need to find answers to how to multiply the trade and investment figures.
Mm-hmm. And has it been more challenging given now U.S.-China relationship is not as collegial compared to the time when you were in D.C. And the two countries, the two powers are competing for their influence in Southeast Asia and for sure, you know, trying to compete for their influence over Indonesia as well. Has it been challenging for Indonesia to navigate?
It's a bit different because we've been pulled in both directions, obviously, right? And for us, it's, what we want to do is clear. We want to be close to Washington, D.C., but we want to be close to Beijing as well. So we want to keep good relations with both countries. And we see in the future, the United States and China will still both be relevant and consequential powers in Southeast Asia, right? So that's not going to change. For us, the question is balance, right? How to...
There's a saying that for Southeast Asia, you're always going to look to the U.S. for security, military security, but you're always going to be more influenced by China as the economic sort of power. Do you think that's fair?
I mean, it's a point that I hear a lot, and it's not totally wrong. I mean, the impressions now is that on economic front, China does a lot of action and has a lot to offer, right? For example, China is expected to import $10 trillion of goods. 500 million tourists will flow out of China, and $500 billion of investments. And I think a lot of countries around the region want a piece of that. And the U.S. is having a hard time competing with it, matching that, right? But on the other hand, the U.S. is still a superpower, has good relations with countries in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, has a high trust factor. You know, strategic trust and political trust is very important in regional affairs and international affairs, and the U.S. has that a lot. And to many Asians, the U.S. is still the country of choice for education, right? And yeah, so
probably values to a certain extent as well.
Yes, yeah.
So you know, in a few weeks, Indonesia will be the highlight of the world when you host G20, when you will have President Biden, President Xi, as well as President Putin all in Bali. How is Indonesia going to manage all that? There's going to be so much interesting dynamics.
You know, the G20 will never be the same after the Russian invasion. You know, they had problems regarding Syrian war, for example. You know, so they had that political issue discussed, but it's never been like this. It's never been this divided, and it's never been fought with such tension. Not just tension, but mistrust and resentment and dislike, right? And sometimes they don't even want to look at one another or smile at one another, and so the psychology is very different now, and so it's really a challenge for Indonesia to be chairman. Our priority is to make sure that G20 remains intact as G20. It should not be G19. It should not be G11 or G13. It remains G20. So that's the first thing. But the challenge is really, in my view, not just making sure that everyone comes, that President Biden comes, President Xi Jinping comes.
Something productive actually comes
exactly.
out of the conference.
And the problem is in the last, in many of the ministerial meetings, they haven't been able to come up with communique because of that.
The negotiation process
yes.
is so hard. Yes.
Especially on the paragraph on Ukraine war. Right, so the big challenge will be for Indonesia to not just preserve G20, but to ensure that there will be a communique in the end that represents the least common denominator that our G20 countries can agree on, especially because in the ministerial level, they haven't been able to produce this communique. You know, at the tourism, at the foreign finance and all, they haven't been able to collapse. Yeah, so it's a matter of concern because yes, we have a divided world, but also we have global challenges that necessitate some kind of global cooperation, climate change, right?
Yes.
World economic rebound, health security, and a few others. So it's going to be a challenging time.
Well, so tell us what you have been focused on. Clearly, your heart is still, trying to do a lot of the diplomatic kind of work. So you have your own think tank now?
I have what is called Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. We started in 2015 with only 12 people, but now we're the largest foreign policy group not just in Indonesia, but in Southeast Asia. And we convened the largest foreign policy conference in the world. In 2019, before COVID arrived, 11,000 people came, and exactly,
incredible. Oh my goodness.
What foreign policy conference can it? But we find a way to reframe foreign policy, to repackage it, so people see it and they see, oh, that's interesting and that's inspiring. Because people used to think foreign policy.
Bring it down to the people's level.
Yes, exactly.
Not just the elites.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we had to change the language, the jargons, and we had to use celebrities to talk about popular issues and so on. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you're doing that, and I know you're, a superstar, not just as a diplomat, but also a very savvy leader as well. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Yeah.